The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 5th chapter. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet, and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some of the people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha, come," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
When the world is crumbling around us, who do we turn to? The reality of this statement is that each of us will feel as though the world is crumbling around us at some point, and most likely at more than one point in our lives. The reality is that things are going to happen. Life is not a day in and day out, sunshine and daisies sort of experience. But who do we turn to in those moments? Who do we lean on? In the aftermath of the 1929 stock market crash, there were reports of bankers and wealthy people hurling themselves out of skyscrapers. As their financial house crumbled, they could not take it. They could not see what could and what would be built in its aftermath. They were hopeless, for they had put their trust in their wealth, in their way of life, in themselves. Who do we turn to when our world is crumbling around us? This morning we met two such people in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus had just returned from the other side of the lake. There he had cast out demons from the Gerasene in the Gentile territory. Now, back in a Jewish community, Immediately he was approached by a man whose world was crumbling around him. A leader in the synagogue comes seeking Jesus' help. He saw the path of what was happening. It must have been like watching a train wreck with no way of stopping anything. This man could see his 12-year-old daughter was dying. He was hopeless, except that he turned to Jesus. Jairus turned to Jesus. His hope was in Jesus. Every other means of healing had failed. But as they were heading to Jairus' home, people were crowding near Jesus. And there we met yet another person whose world had crumbled. A woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The impact of that reality is beyond our modern senses. Her constant hemorrhaging caused her to be ritually unclean. Anything and anyone she came in contact with was made also unclean. She was living as an outcast from the norms of life. She could not worship or participate fully in life. Even her family was impacted by her uncleanliness. Her world had crumbled and she was living in utter brokenness for 12 long years. Yet in her need, she turned to Jesus. She hoped in Jesus. If only I can touch the hem of his garment. She turned to Jesus as her only hope, and immediately she was healed. She literally could feel the healing of her body. And with this came the restoration of life. Not the life she had lost for those long 12 years, but rather new life, new possibilities that did not exist before Jesus. In Jesus, she received a new beginning. A new world was being built. And Jesus looked at her, knowing what had happened, and he called her daughter. He gave her a status filled with grace. Yet even as this unclean woman had disrupted the walk to Jairus' house, her healing happened at the expense of Jesus getting to Jairus' house quick enough. And word came. She was dead. Jairus' world was now crumbled down fully. Jairus' focus would not turn to burying the dead, grieving the lost, preparing for life without his beloved daughter. Sadness. His world had crumbled. Yet Jesus looks at him and says, "Do not fear, only believe." Amidst Jairus' world in utter crumbledness, Jesus calls him to hope. Jesus calls on him to trust. Dare to trust in Jesus. Dare to hope in Jesus. Jesus enters the house, takes the grieving parents to their daughter's bed, and there he touches her dead body, calling her to get up, calling her to awaken from death. And immediately she did. In Jesus, this little girl was a new creation, a new possibility. Her parents' crumbled world was now reconstructed, not into what it was that led to death, but into a new possibility. Who do you turn to when your world is crumbling? Who do you put your trust in when life is shaking and breaking apart? So often, we put our trust in things that pass away. We put our trust in our wealth, and our planning, or our way of life as we like it. Or we put our trust in systems and things of this world that will always fail us. The ideal that we can handle it on our own, which no one really can. The idea that I am self-sufficient and it is all dependent on me is false. God did not form you and me to be solo artists on a tightrope. God formed us to know and to trust God, who provides all we have and more than we can imagine. God formed us to know and be loved by God. Trusting in Jesus in the face of the crumbling world does not mean things will remain the same without change. Trusting in Jesus amidst what feels like our world crumbling means that we know Jesus is not done and that new possibilities are yet unfolding. Trusting in Jesus welcomes us to see new life amidst that which makes us clean and makes us unclean. Trusting in Jesus welcomes us to be resurrected life in the face of what happens to be death. Trusting in Jesus brings us into new life. Who do you turn to when your life is crumbling? Turn to Jesus. Amen. Please stand as able.